Modern hunger is an inconvenience. You tap a screen, and food arrives. In the 19th century, hunger was a force that shattered rules, erased morality, and turned survival into something unthinkable. Victorian society liked to believe civilization was solid, but famine, cold, and isolation proved it was fragile. The era built empires and factories, but it also produced extreme survival stories. Cannibalism was never normal or accepted. It was a last resort, born of desperation or used as a tool of power. In every case, it revealed the same truth. Hunger does not negotiate with ethics. The Arctic dream that ate itself. In 1845, Britain launched what it believed would be its crowning achievement in Arctic exploration, an attempt to chart the Northwest Passage. Two ships, Ms. Erebus and Ms. Terror, carried 128 men under the command of Sir John Franklin, a respected naval officer and national icon. The vessels were marvels of Victorian confidence, reinforced hulls, onboard heating, libraries, and enough preserved food to reassure officials back home that everything would be fine. Everything was not fine. By 1846, both ships were frozen solid near King William Island. Temperatures plunged to levels that made exposed skin blister within minutes. Scurvy weakened bodies. Lead poisoning from poorly sealed food tins quietly destroyed minds. Eventually, the ships were abandoned. What followed was a slow-motion collapse that Britain would struggle to accept for decades. Search expeditions found scattered camps, discarded equipment, and human bones bearing unmistakable cut marks. Some had been cracked open to extract marrow. Inuit testimony described bodies mutilated in ways that left little room for interpretation. Forensic studies conducted more than a century later confirmed what Victorian society had desperately hoped was untrue. Members of the expedition had resorted to cannibalism. This was not a story of savagery. It was a story of isolation, starvation, and imperial arrogance colliding in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The Franklin expedition did not fail because its men were weak. It failed because confidence could not substitute for adaptability, and pride could not keep bodies alive. The Donner Party and the cost of a shortcut. A year later, and thousands of miles away, another disaster unfolded. This time not in the Arctic, but in the American West. In 1846, 87 emigrants set out for California in search of land and opportunity. Among them were members of the Donner Party, families who believed they were following the promise of westward expansion. Their mistake was trusting a shortcut. The Hastings Cutoff, advertised as a faster route, was anything but. It slowed the group, drained supplies, and pushed them dangerously late into the season. When they reached the Sierra Nevada, winter arrived early and without mercy. Snow buried wagons, froze livestock, and trapped the group for months near what is now Donner Lake. As food vanished, survival became arithmetic. Leather was boiled, bones were chewed, bark was eaten. When even that failed, the dead became sustenance for the living. Some accounts suggest darker choices, murders disguised as necessity, but even the confirmed facts are grim enough. By the time rescuers arrived, only 46 people remained alive. The Donner Party became infamous not because of cannibalism alone, but because their story exposed the fragility of optimism. Manifest Destiny promised abundance. Nature responded with indifference. Ireland's hunger and the power of a rumor. The Great Irish Famine killed over 1 million people and forced millions more to flee their homeland. It was a catastrophe shaped by crop failure, colonial policy, and systemic neglect. Starvation, disease, and displacement defined the era, but cannibalism entered the story in a more complicated way. Victorian newspapers circulated lurid tales of grave robbing and flesh consumption among the starving poor. Some accounts were rooted in rare, desperate incidents. Others were exaggerations or outright fabrications, fueled by anti-Irish prejudice and the sensationalism of the press. Cannibalism became a symbol, less of reality and more of how British society framed Irish suffering, as something grotesque, alien, and morally distant. Historians still debate how widespread such acts truly were. What remains indisputable is the scale of suffering that made the rumors believable. When hunger becomes total, The unimaginable no longer feels impossible. Ethiopia's evil days and the spectacle of suffering. In the late 19th century, Ethiopia endured a devastating sequence of disasters known as Kifu Chen, evil days. A cattle disease introduced through imported livestock wiped out the majority of the nation's herds. Droughts followed. Locusts arrived. Epidemics spread. Civil conflict worsened everything. By the end, roughly 1/3 of the population had died. In this environment, cannibalism occurred, not as cultural practice, but as extreme survival. European audiences consumed these stories eagerly, turning Ethiopian suffering into moral spectacle. Victorian readers framed famine-fed cannibalism as proof of moral decay, ignoring the imperial systems that amplified the crisis. Hunger did not emerge from superstition or savagery. It emerged from ecological collapse, global trade failures, and indifference from those with the power to intervene. Missionaries, colonial fear, and the myth of the cannibal island. In 1839, British missionary John Williams arrived on Erromango Island in what is now Vanuatu. He came with religious conviction and little understanding of local history. The islanders remembered earlier encounters with Europeans very differently, marked by exploitation, violence, and betrayal. Williams and his companion were killed shortly after landing. Their bodies were consumed in a ritual act tied to local customs and resistance. In Britain, the event ignited panic. The narrative of cannibal islands flourished, providing moral justification for deeper colonial intrusion. The irony was obvious, though rarely acknowledged. Europeans portrayed themselves as civilizers confronting savagery, even as imperial expansion brought devastation across the globe. The case that changed British law. In 1884, the yacht Mignonette sank in the South Atlantic. 4 survivors escaped in a lifeboat with no food or water. After weeks adrift, 2 crew members killed and ate the teenage cabin boy, Richard Parker. When they were rescued, Britain faced a legal crisis. The case of R.V. Dudley and Stevens forced the courts to answer a grim question. Can necessity justify murder? The answer was no. Though their death sentence was commuted, the ruling established a critical precedent. Survival did not excuse killing. Civilization, the court argued, must hold even when hunger demands otherwise. Cannibalism is terror. Perhaps the darkest story is not one of starvation at all. In 1837, the Portuguese slave ship Arrogance was intercepted carrying hundreds of enslaved African children. Survivors testified that the crew killed one captive, cooked the body, and forced others to eat it. This was not survival. It was domination. No one was punished. The testimony of African children was dismissed. The incident disappeared into colonial silence, even as Europeans continued to justify slavery by labeling Africans as savages. The hypocrisy was complete. Hunger, power, and the fragile mask of civilization. Victorian cannibalism stories are not tales of monsters. They are mirrors. They show what happens when systems collapse, when empires fail, and when survival eclipses ideology. Hunger does not care about class, morality, or reputation. It strips people down to biology. The real horror is not that cannibalism occurred, but that it so often emerged alongside indifference, arrogance, and power misused. Civilization does not end with hunger. It reveals what civilization truly was all along. History loves to dress itself up as progress, but stories like these remind us how thin that costume really is. When hunger, fear, and power collide, the rules we think define civilization can vanish faster than food on an empty table. These moments aren't just gruesome footnotes, they're warnings, written in bone. If you want more stories that dig into history's darkest corners and ask the uncomfortable questions, make sure you like and subscribe. And tell us in the comments which story stuck with you the most. Because the past is only quiet if we stop listening.